Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. On today's episode, I want to begin by saying, as a leader, this could be the most important thing that you will ever hear. For some of you, if you're like me, this is going to be a code cracker. We're going to be talking in an entire series of episodes on the leader's kryptonite, emotional fusion versus differentiation. That's right. And you don't have to know at this point what that is all about. But I'm so excited that you've joined us today. Well, let me begin by asking this question. Do you ever think to yourself, I've developed every kind of hard skill competency that I possibly can. I've trained, I've gone to conferences, I've hired consultants, counselors, read books, but I just seem to struggle. I struggle in executing the family, organizational, or overall leadership successes that I dream of. Maybe you have wrestled with everything you have to win, only to compare your wins to your ultimate dreams, and you come away feeling like a failure or that it's all just futile. Well, here's some more questions. Do you feel stressed? Do you feel burned out? Do you feel ready to quit? Well, what is the secret to the code? What is the key understanding to all of this stuff? Well, my favorite organizational leadership psychologists posit with conviction that understanding the dynamics that we're talking about can best be seen and interpreted through Dr. Murray Bowen's family systems theory. And the same reality that we can experience within our family systems, we also are going to mirror and experience in our church systems, our business systems, our friend systems, really any kind of relational system there is. What Bowen presented is that those stressed out states, those burned out states, those give up states are not due to overworking or lacking competency, hard skills, but due to unresolved fusion, or what some synonymous terms could be enmeshment. They are unresolved fusion or enmeshment issues and a person's inability to self-differentiate and therefore to self-regulate. So what is the definition of self-differentiation? It's the ability to define, to hold on to, and to regulate one's own beliefs, values, goals, and emotional states in the midst of surrounding togetherness, and even under the pressure of all of that togetherness. It's this understanding that there's always pressure to conform to any system of relationships, whether it's family, a congregation, a corporation, or a nonprofit organization. And it is the awareness that there are these surrounding togetherness pressures that literally drive us and pressure us to conform. Leadership through self-differentiation is the idea that there is a particular way that we can function in any system that actually is more effective in leading people, especially if leading people is to lead them to change. As Jack Shitama says, and if you're not leading change, you're really not leading at all. You're just managing, come on now, somebody, the status quo. As a senior leader in the world of Christianity and church, as a pastor and then a conference speaker for over 35 years, I can say with confidence that the underground issue of most every, if not every issue, from depression, anxiety, rage, to parenting and marital distress, to work and professional conflicts, to church griefs and losses, is the immaturity of emotional development in self-differentiation. Even after clients become psychoeducated and aware of this dynamic, they still struggle to see enmeshment happening in real time within their relationship systems. To understand the power of self-differentiation as a human and equally as a leader, many of our great neuroscientists, psychologists, and pastors have written extensively about it. And to be undifferentiated is the kryptonite for many highly competent, skilled, and trained leaders. Dr. Dan Siegel, he's a renowned neuroscientist and psychiatrist. He says this: differentiation is one of two of the most important abilities that are required for human flourishing. And that's not a quote. That's something that I heard him say. I think it's close to a quote. And then his co-author in many of his books is Dr. Tina Payne Bryson. She's somebody that we've had on the Red Ink Revival Leadership podcast. She writes about parenting in the Yes Brain Child, and she says this: when differentiation is not maintained, empathy can feel overwhelming and even lead to burnout. Dr. Bryson's just simply saying that being undifferentiated is a primary underlying factor for parenting to be emotionally exhausting. And the same is true in marriage, the same is true as a pastor, the same is true if you're leading an organization or just leading a team somewhere at work or at church. We also hear from marriage therapist experts like Doctors Ellen Bader or John Gottman or David Schnarch. They all speak of differentiation as being a fundamental cornerstone to make a marriage and family work. Failing marriages need to first identify their self-differentiation maturity levels, and that's in contrast to emotional fusion and enmeshment that they functioned in for some time. And here's my bias. I am biased, and I have critiques that typical Christian marriage books and teachings that are authored by pastors and some famous voices within Christian circles, that typically Christian authors will focus on conflicts around communication, money, sex, politics, and religion. However, when you help couples become differentiated, here's what's crazy to me: you actually bring health to all the other areas without reducing the issues to various surface techniques. In fact, my bias is the surface techniques don't answer the deeper issues. We're, again, trying to answer million-dollar questions with nickels and dimes. Again, another quote about differentiation is Dr. Gabor Mate. He's a famous MD and an addiction recovery expert. He says in his book, When the Body Says No, watch this. He says a fundamental concept in family systems theory, which is Dr. Bowen I've been talking about, is differentiation, defined as the ability to be in emotional contact with others, yet still autonomous in one's emotional functioning. I love that. The poorly differentiated person, Gabor Mate continues, lacks an emotional boundary between himself and others and lacks a boundary that prevents his, her, or her thinking processes from being overwhelmed by his emotional or her emotional feeling processes. So the thinking processes get overwhelmed by the emotional feeling processes. And then Gabor Mate continues, he automatically absorbs anxiety from others and generates considerable anxiety within himself and, of course, herself as well. What Gabor continues by showing studies in all of his writings about how physical illness is clearly associated with enmeshed emotional attachments within our systems of relationships. Gabor says greater differentiation means better physical health. And then, of course, the famous Christian author and psychologist, Dr. Henry Cloud, he's written Boundaries, famous for the book Boundaries. Well, he says in his leadership book on integrity, it's named Integrity, one of the key distinct elements of an intact character is differentiation. The identity is intact. Differentiation gives you an identity that is intact. So they do not need external performance, approval, image, symbols, riches, organizations, or affiliations. Come on, somebody. And the like, to know who they are or to regulate how they feel. And then my friend, Pastor Steve Cuss, he's the author of Managing Leadership Anxiety. Again, been on the Red Ink Leadership podcast. And he says this: some of history's bravest leaders are often the most differentiated. Steve honors this idea that for a leader to be effective with a team, group, or nation, they must lead with a differentiated self. Also, there's a guy named Peter Steinke, I think is how you say his name. He was the founder of Voyagers. He was a pastor, church consultant, and a noted author of this book called Uproar, Calm Leadership in Anxious Times. And he says, as for leadership, until and unless you recognize the power of your own instinctual life, so the emotional drivers that are coming online and driving us long before our thinking life, he says, unless you recognize the power of your own instinctual life, you will continue to assess outside conditions, persons, or ideas to be the cause of your and others' nervous unrest. So in response, you use your energy to rectify, control, and eliminate the outside stimuli. Well, you can imagine how absolutely exhausting that would be. Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and I am a husband, father, pastor of 35 years, and a strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all arenas of life. I am an inerrantist, a Calvinist Arminian betweenist, a Holy Spirit continuist, and a finished work of Christ redemptionist. Red Ink Revival was designed to create a revival in the heart, soul, and brains of Christian leaders from all spheres of influence. Our team of pastors, psychologists, and therapists facilitate our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our goal is to bring a revival, an integrated wholeness to pastors, church staff, the local church, and the universal Big C church around the world. This includes marketplace leaders, educators, foster adoptive parents, and so much more. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcast? Also, please like the episodes, comment on them, and share them on your social media feeds. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it at Apple. And if it's true of you, give us 5 stars. Now let's go back to this week's episode. For me, for Patrick Norris, this differentiation is a fundamental key for my own leadership learnings. And this is a big deal to me, guys. As a pastor, I went to every conference, read every book, rubbed shoulders, and received mentoring from the biggest churches and pastors. And listen, I am competent. I mean, I'm not without some skills. I can teach and preach, I can counsel, I can organize, I can create. But undifferentiation or fusion was my kryptonite. And I literally suffered the torment of thinking, what's a guy got to do? So as a friend, you can imagine on this podcast how I would want to be a heralder of truth. And I actually want to get this emotional quality of relationships and leadership. I want to get it out on the table and begin talking about it. So partly my issues and my passion is because none of the conferences, none of the books, none of the mentorings that I got was what we're talking about here ever addressed. And yet it is fundamental to every successful, healthy leader in every healthy organization. Today, I do use self-differentiation in my family, at church, with friends, in friend circles, in therapeutic coaching, and any leadership relationship that I have. And I'm growing. I'm still not perfect at it. And I just want to offer to everyone, you're not going to be perfect at it either. You're never going to be perfect at it. But you are going to be able to escalate your skills, and therefore you're going to be able to see some significant changes. You might be wondering, why, Patrick, were you undifferentiated? Well, let me give you a little backstory on me. I was raised in a family where my mom got pregnant at 17 and unmarried with my older brother, who's 2 years older than I am. So he is born in distress. Mom's in high distress. Well, if you understand the neurobiology of emotions and how a brain begins to evolve and to attach and connect to the world and make sense of all that's around it, it begins with the infrastructure of mom or mom and dad's own way of interacting and actually absolving or mitigating the anxieties that are in them. Well, as time goes on, somewhere along the line, my mom should have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And what happens in borderline personality disorder is there's huge swings. You can be just higher than a kite, excited about life and people, and then you swing to you're not excited about people. In fact, the very people you were excited about just a few minutes ago, now you can't stand. Generally, it happens over weeks or months, but there is this swing and the intolerance of being able to live in the middle, to live between these two extremes. And the features of borderline personality disorder is that this person has many of the factors that show they are themselves trying to figure out how to relate and attach and not be fused, and yet try to figure out their own sense of self, their identity. And because they have lost that or they're not competent in that, then they have a low maturity level in self-differentiation. And again, they end up suffering. Well, this is the place I'm born. And then with a lot of fighting and struggles, as you can imagine, within their marriage, mom and dad end up divorcing at in my teenage years. And then I actually was the one as a teenager, actually a sophomore, that was, gifted and cursed with the need to work with my mom. I lived with her, and she emotionally derived her sense of stability from me because there obviously were some gifts, even emerging as a teenager. I had some kindness and wisdom and willingness to listen to all of her distresses. Well, over time, I become fused emotionally with her. I learned from a child, but now I'm in the intensity of it as a teenager, how to adapt to mom's, I'm going to call it crazy. And all of that became a part of my instincts. My instincts were that the way that you survive and the way you belong is that you adapt to the emotions of those in your system. And so I inherited these emotional fusion traits in my leadership style. And so as a leader, whenever there was rejection or somebody is abandoning or even somebody's criticizing, that to me all equals detachment. It all equals that I must turn away because the emotions are so intense that something must not be okay with me. Something must have been said or been done. What could I do better? How could I make this better? And it wasn't just that I was looking for areas of growth only. It was the anxiety of an undifferentiated self who's trying to come online to be able to be okay, to just be okay. Anytime I would receive, anxiety-driven correction or just simple feedback from others, maybe I'm, as a pastor or a leader, desiring to give feedback to someone else or a correction to them. It could go both ways. The intensity of emotion would just begin to build, and I would rehearse it. I'm one of those people that I'm driving down the road, and while I'm driving down the road thinking about some intensified engagement in a relationship, maybe one that I'm leading or somebody has said or done something, what I am doing is I'm rehearsing the potential conversation in the car while I'm driving. And again, I'm by myself, and so it just feels like I've got good practice going on. However, what that is that is anxiety about the conversation. It isn't the settling of who I am or what I'm about. It is the hiding behind the accurate articulation, thinking that it will protect me from actually being rejected, abandoned, criticized, or being put out, or somebody just not caring about me anymore. And so I would tend, as a leader and even as a parent, to triangulate to manage my emotions. And this is in every area of my life. It's not exclusive to one area of relationship. Again, it's in my leadership as a pastor. It's in my marriage. It's in my parenting with my kids. It's in my extended family. It's in my friendships. And triangulating means that what I would do is I would pull somebody else into that conversation, and maybe I'd vent. I'd pull another staff member in, a volunteer, and I would vent. And the deep need to be understood was about differentiation or a lack of differentiation. Hey, have you ever wanted to explore how your backstory is influencing your present story? Have you ever wondered why you were driven the way you were driven, or why you want the things you so deeply want, or why you might be triggered the way you're triggered? Maybe there's something in your life that keeps derailing you or exposing the fractures in your heart and soul. At Red Ink Revival, I facilitate groups of 6 to 10 men or 6 to 10 ladies in an exploration process that includes worksheets, tools for discovery, and insights into personal motivations, torments, and reactions. And it's all done online through Zoom in a short 6-week experience. Now don't worry, you won't be required to share anything you don't want to. Your story is yours to share when and where you're ready. But first, you owe it to yourself to know what that story actually is. Our alumni report having life-changing experiences and integrations in all spheres of life. They report it actually felt like they entered into a revival. They even say they now lead others like never before as they instinctively map their teammates' own story considerations. We're developing groups specific for individual classifications like senior pastors or spouses, church staff, educators, foster adoption parents, marketplace leaders, and churches at large. Go to redinkrevival.com and find the events tab to learn more. And I'm endeavoring and triangulating or venting to somebody else is to transfer some of this anxiety to them so that they can mitigate it and help manage it with me. I don't ever have conscious awareness of that. That's not what I was intending to do. But now if you zoom out, now look at that scenario. In that scenario, you are experiencing a staff member who's hearing information and energy of anxiety about somebody else that's in the system. And this anxiety is something that they realize is boiling on the inside of me, whether they're conscious of it or unconscious, that's happening. They are recognizing that I am inviting them to mitigate it. This isn't a functional triangulation, by the way. A functional one is here is what's going on. This is what they did, and here's some possible solutions to deal with it. For me, it was the anxiety. Now, listen. Anytime you've got anxiety in a system, anytime you have anxiety in a relationship, there's going to be an immediate sense of insecurity in the one who's hearing the anxiety. Anxiety is about threat. Threat is, I'm not safe. So you have team members who are immediately beginning to feel unsafe themselves, and they don't know why. And so when they don't feel safe, you're dealing with trust, you're dealing with intimacy. So you actually are eroding the very connections within the system that are necessary to be a functional system. And so for me, again, you can begin to see how indifferentiated self, a self that isn't aware of who I am and who I'm not, where I go and where I don't go, what I want and what I don't want, it will give high levels of anxiety that torment and wear that person down to where they're burned out, they're ready to quit, they're frustrated, they're irritated, anger rises up, or they just shut down. And this is where, listen, 70% of pastors are statistically reporting that they deal with ongoing issues of depression. This is where that takes place. So let me ask you, do you have any of these, or do these sound familiar to you? Maybe these are statements you could identify with. Think about each and every one of these, and then you might just in your imagination mark which ones of these are actually true of you. Listen, I often feel inhibited around my family, staff, church family, colleagues, and friends. I feel inhibited. Or when someone disappoints me, I withdraw from them for a time. Or I tend to distance myself when people get too close to me. Or maybe you think, I wish I wasn't so frickin' emotional. I wish I wasn't so emotional. Or maybe my spouse, kids, staff, colleagues, or friends could not tolerate it if I were to express to them my true feelings about some things. I want you to recognize the disempowerment and the victimization of such a statement. My spouse, kids, staff, colleagues, or friends could not tolerate if I were to express to them my true feelings about some things. Or how about this? I often feel my spouse, kids, staff, colleagues, or friends want too much from me. They just want too much. What is that? It's an undifferentiated self. If someone is upset with me, I can't seem to let it go easily. Do you resonate with that? If somebody's upset with me, I can't seem to let it go easily. Or when my spouse, kids, staff, colleagues, or friends disagree with me or give me feedback, I feel insulted and I get angry. I get irritated. Or maybe I feel the need to over-explain my position so people will be sure to understand me. Over-explaining is an issue of anxiety. And the anxiety is driven by an undifferentiated self, a fused self to others. And ours, at that moment, our sense of security, our sense of survival, our sense of belonging is all fused to it. Maybe this is you. Arguments or hashing out conflicting ideas. Arguments or hashing out conflicting ideas with my spouse, kids, staff, colleagues, or friends. They just make me feel awful, make me feel awful. Again, this is a symptom of a person who's undifferentiated. Or maybe you can resonate with this. I bend sometimes after I say no to others because I feel pressure and I don't want to disappoint them. Or how about this? I often wonder about the kind of impression I create. Do any of those sound familiar to you? Do you resonate? Do you feel even the emotions of those as you are hearing them? What happens is a lot of times these statements hide behind sensitivity, concern, empathy, and good spirituality. A lot of times people think, I'm really doing good. I'm a sensitive person, not realizing that it's healthy to be sensitive. It's a huge difference in being sensitive out of empathy versus being sensitive out of anxiety. In other words, love is I'm sensitive because I care about you. But if my caring about you is connected to my own survival and belonging, kabam, this is where troubles happen. So listen to these. I overreact and I hear feedback as a personal attack. I'm more emotionally affected by the one person who's critical of me than the 100 who aren't. My emotions are fused to the emotions of the people around me. I'm not okay unless the people around me are okay. If my organization experiences conflict, I must not be a very good leader. Notice how there is a complete interpretation that is filled with intensified emotion. Or how about this? I'm preoccupied with my faults, weaknesses, and opinions of others. I'm preoccupied with their faults, weaknesses, and opinions. I'm preoccupied. I keep looking at everybody's faults. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the brain that's tried to cause me to survive and belong. And now then I'm scanning for other people because I'm still ping-ponging back and forth between where I am and where other people are in this undefined, this undifferentiated self. This fused self is actually creating havoc. How about this? I need people around me to think, believe, and act like me. That is interesting. I need people around me to think, believe, and act like me. The issue here is around anxiety, the anxiety behind it. There's a difference between an organizational leader who has set forward the mission, the vision, and the values, and for the love of all of the people is holding tight to those. That's different than I need people to think, believe, and act like me because the anxiety within me means that the only way we're going to make it is if I build clones. That's a problem. In fact, that is where dictatorship, that's where cults, that's where all number of dysfunctions happen in systems. Well, here's another one. I feel better about myself when I'm with famous people or people that are highly successful. I got to be honest, this is one that I hear about me, have my whole life. I've been praised for it because I've gotten to hang out with some highly skilled, highly famous type people. And I got to be transparent. It makes me feel so good. I love that. I love the attention. I love being around people. And I have often excused it to say, well, you got to be around sharp people to learn sharp things. And that part's true. But that part is assuming there's not an underlying, undifferentiated anxiety that is driving my need to be in situations where other people are. Here's one. I judge myself by my intentions, but other people by their behavior. My intentions need to be seen, but other people, can you believe what they did? Can you believe what they said? Oh my gosh. How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you will do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details. All of that, in the Bible, we think about it in terms of gossip or somebody who is maligning another person, somebody who's envying another person. We think about all these other judgmentalism type teachings and ideas. We talk about that, and yet what those are fundamentally addressing is our differentiated self. Or how about this one? Keeping everyone together and keeping the peace is more important than progress and growth. Got to keep the peace. It's more important than progress and growth. Or here's one: I have to die to self and live for everybody else. You do know that Jesus didn't even do that, right? You do realize that dying to self was not something propagated scripturally to where you lose yourself. It is that you define yourself. You know who you are. You're established in what you want and don't want. You know where you begin and where you end. And then in that context, and without anxiety to achieve or to become, you're able to make a decision that God, Lord Jesus, Holy Spirit, I choose you. I want to serve you. I'll give my life. But you can't give what you don't already know is yours. And you can't do that without self-definition or without differentiation. And so for me, I spent just so many years as an undifferentiated leader, and I was believing that I was best serving the organization and the people that were around me the best. And here's the deal. My mentors were undifferentiated. My mentors were. While being very individually separate, they didn't focus on the maturity scale of being separate and together. My mentors were that if you want to be around me, do what you got to do to be around me. If you don't want to be around me, don't be around me. And there wasn't the top down in terms of leadership positions. There wasn't the leaning down into to nurture the connection, the attachment, the togetherness. And so when you have differentiation, you are actually promoting both the separateness and the togetherness, not one at the expense of the other. Maturity means that you're able to move up the pyramid, up to the top point where both sides come to this beautiful point, and you're able to tolerate both and hold on to yourself without compromise, without abdicating, without anxiety, and still leaning in to be attached to others. My mentors even taught spiritual and scriptural reasons to detach from people, ultimately and knowingly promoting principles of undifferentiated leadership formation. Again, ultimately and unknowingly, they were promoting stuff that was actually going to be damaging. And so maybe you had mentors like me where you've been taught. I remember hearing that when one leaves the fold, that Jesus goes after the one and leaves the 99. What is that? Well, you got to understand what happened to the one. Did the one leave because they were intentionally trying to leave, or were they leaving because they just were preoccupied, distracted, and wandered off? Well, it's interesting. Jesus doesn't give a statement about motive. Why? Why did this sheep do this? My mentors would say things like, well, if it's a rebel sheep, Jesus wouldn't go after him, a rebel sheep. In other words, what we're describing here is the undifferentiated self that is protecting. So now I just have to protect me. A differentiated self says that not only am I separate, but I'm able to lean in. I'm able to now promote how do I connect with the people who have actually now then left, or they are, we'll say, rebelling. They are a renegade sheep. The point that I'm trying to give is that in my life, so many of my examples and some of the teaching that I heard was around basically you do you. And it's not about both the individual definition of self, the identity, knowing where you begin and where you end, knowing what you want and don't want, and yet at the same time, holding on to yourself, mitigating the anxiety, learning to deal with how there is no need to be driven by the anxiety. The anxiety is going to create a toxic environment. And at the same time, connect with people, but you don't connect with people for the sake of feeling better about you. You connect with people because you are a person who is differentiated and you have the capacity now to love and serve. So how do we mature in self-differentiation? How do we mature in this? Well, let's review again this definition. That self-definition or self-differentiation is this: the ability to define, hold on to, and regulate one's own beliefs, values, goals, and emotional states in the midst of surrounding togetherness and even under pressure. Dr. Murray Bowen, the founder of family system theory, he actually defined it again as this: the degree of resilience to the interpersonal contagion of anxiety. This is got so much depth to this. The degree of resilience, this is how you would define differentiation. The degree of resilience, the bounce back, to the interpersonal contagion of anxiety. In other words, anxiety grows in interpersonal systems. And then he goes on to say, the interpersonal contagion of anxiety in a relationship system. How well and how mature do we handle anxiety in our relationship systems? Another way to describe it is this: you could also think of self-differentiation as taking responsibility for the management of one's own anxiety and reactivity and issues. In other words, it isn't my responsibility, even emotionally, to over or to consider that somehow I'm culpable for someone else's emotional meltdown, for their dysregulation, for their disappointment, for the things that they don't like. Now, if I'm differentiated, I can lean in with empathy and compassion. I can feel what they feel. Recently, I was talking with someone who was let go of a major league baseball team. And they had been a part of the organization for many, many years. And the general manager, who cared about them, knew them, whenever they were let go, this friend, the general manager leaned back into him and called him and said, "Are you okay?" Well, what is that? That's keeping connection while you are holding on to the differentiated self. Well, if I think about the biblical foundations for self-differentiation, I want to promote this. I want to posture it that Even salvation, the idea that we can be born again, that we can get the gift of God's grace in this thing called salvation, that it is an individually defining thing. In other words, each individual has to define and decide what they're going to believe, and then in their faith, receive the gift of God's grace. In other words, it's not a group system kind of accountability. The salvation is an individual thing, a separate thing. So we begin with the idea of free moral agency, that God gave every one of us the ability as free moral people to choose what we want. And so when we think of self-differentiation, we're actually elevating the idea of God's gift of free moral gifting or free moral action. And then, of course, Jesus says things like in Matthew 16:19, this famous verse, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Most translations in the original Greek, they bear out that the word bind and loose is more about what you will allow, heaven will allow. What you forbid, heaven will forbid. What is that? That is God honoring free moral agency.
Pastors, did you know that upwards of 70% of the men in your congregation are regularly accessing pornography, stuck in shame, torn in conflict, and therefore immobilized for zealous ministry? That's 7 out of 10. The problem is not going to go away. What are you doing to lead your men into wholeness? Porn and sex addiction is characterized by undesirable compulsive behaviors that feature incongruence with personal values, and it interferes with normal living, causing stress on their relationships with God, family, friends, loved ones, and possibly even their own work environment. Well, where do you send men to recover and become both whole and integrated? Red Ink Recovery offers a unique program exclusive to porn and sex-related addictions. Our clinical professionals, our psychologists and therapists, have created a transformative treatment process that collects the dots, connects the dots, and corrects the dots that have driven the addictions. Our approach heals the heart, restores the soul, and rebuilds the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our clients find their lives have been wildly marked by Christ as they are given a path for trust being rebuilt. And they are resourced for far greater relationships and intimacy than they have ever known before. All of our professional teammates are experts in the field of sexual addiction. They are all trained by Dr. Patrick Carnes and certified by the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Dr. Carnes is known as the father and curator of modern sexual addiction recovery as a movement. Pastors, we encourage you to recommend your men who struggle to come to one of our intensives. If you are just a simple man that struggles, maybe you're new to the faith or you don't even know what you believe about Christ, be encouraged to join us. We will honor your journey and give you the tools to live in wholeness. To find out more about our porn and sex addiction intensives and when the next one is, go to redinkrevival.com.
In free moral agency, you have a beginning and an end. In individuality, you have this ability to decide what you want and don't want, where you want to go and don't want to go, what you will tolerate and what you won't tolerate. And then one of my favorite texts around this whole topic of differentiation is in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 20 and verse 27, and I'll just again read it. But now indeed there are many members, yet one body. Think about this. There are many members, but one body. What this is doing is promoting the parts. That until you have a clearly defined part, the organs of our body, the tissues of our body, the various, even down to cellular level, our body is made up of unique individual parts. And each individual part needs to know who it is and who it's not. And not, in this text, he goes on to say, you can't say, if you're a part of the body, that I wish I was another part of the body. And then he ends it up with, now you are the body of Christ and members individually. So watch this. You have many members, many parts that are individual that make up the system. You can't have healthy systems till you have healthy members, healthy parts, healthy individuality. Now, let's think about for a minute the understanding of this concept of self-differentiation. I'm going to move further into it with you. This is from Dr. Kirk Honda's work and giving an overview of what self-differentiation is all about. And he uses Murray Bowen's terminology. And number one, anxiety. Anxiety is the word that Bowen used in family systems theory as a general term of emotional tension or stress. So when Bowen was talking about anxiety in the indifferentiated or undifferentiated self, that when you don't know who you are and who you're not, when you haven't begun to decide the qualities that make up your sense of identity, when you don't know what you believe, what you feel, what you want, when you haven't decided who you are, when you're not clear about those things, then you're going to have emotional tension and stress. This is where generalized anxiety comes and roosts in our lives. Generalized anxiety is I don't know what the enemy is. And because I haven't clearly defined what the enemy is, then everything is the enemy. There are enemies lurking in the shadows. So anytime you have a client who's working with generalized anxiety, the coaching is to move them to the specification as to what is the actual anxiety about, what's your threats. And as you can get the clarification of what an exact threat is, actually your brain will eliminate all of the other energy fights, all of the other threats, because it says those are no longer threats. I don't need to be on guard. And so it begins to calm. So again, generalized anxiety is when you haven't identified what the enemy is. Well, you can't identify what the enemy is until you know who you are, until you know what you want, until you know where you begin and where you end. And so when we go back to family systems theory, anxiety is just this general term around all emotional tension and stress. And what Bowen believed is that anxiety will move through the system from one person to the next. In fact, it is very much a virus, and it will create an epidemic or a pandemic. And he believed that what happens is that it impairs our ability to think and reason, that when you have higher levels of anxiety, and you need to understand this is neurobiological. This is talking about biochemistry. This is talking about the way our body and nervous system functions. This is about even the soul energy that is behind it. If your soul can prosper, understand your soul can actually be in a deficit. So even in your soul level, this immaterial side of who you are, you've got all of this functioning that's taking place. And that when in your brain and in your nervous system, you have an emotional surge, it will begin to shut down the activity in the cognitive parts of the brain. And you begin to have irrational but highly emotional reasons to do things. And what's crazy is, this is just wild to me, that when you're highly anxious, your brain will begin to accommodate it with interpretations. Your brain will begin to accommodate it with information and alignment to give you the confirmation of your bias. And so it's important that we address these anxieties, but you can't address what you don't even know is there. Bowen also believed that many presenting problems that we have in our lives, any of these things that come in our environment and in our space, some of which have to do with the emotional regulation, again, rage, depression, whether we're talking about the way we manage teams, the way we lead organizations, the way we function in our marriage, the way that we parent our kids. He says that these presenting problems that are in the systems are the result of anxiety and stress. And so the second term that Bowen would use in family systems is this idea of togetherness versus separateness. And what Bowen believed is that all life possesses these two opposing forces. That togetherness forces us
to be with others, or it compels us to be with others, to seek approval and to attach to others. But separateness forces us, that force compels us to be independent or to have our own beliefs and to not be smothered by others. Bowen asserted that we strive for balance between the two forces. What differentiation does is says, I'm not going to be a person who's seeking approval. I'm not going to be somebody who's just compelled to whatever I've got to do to satisfy the system. I'm not going to be that guy or gal. And separateness, I'm not going to be so individual that now I'm detached. I'm no longer a part of the system. I have to be in some way avoidant to it. He says that really the greatest health of a human being is when we strive for the balance between the two forces. And if we do balance it well, we can be close to our loved ones, our teams, our churches, etc., without losing our sense of individuality. And then, of course, Bowen uses this third terminology, and that is the feeling versus the intellectual as a guidance system. The feeling guidance system, as in contrast to the intellectual guidance system, Bowen believed that we do have these two inner guidance systems. And the feeling guidance system involves emotion, automatic reactions, knee-jerk reactions, these instincts and these urges, etc. That the intellectual guidance system involves thinking and judgment and logic and rational thought reasoning, etc. What Bowen asserted is in order to make functional decisions, we need to access both guidance systems and we need to be able to differentiate between them. So now, let me clarify. There are two basic differentiation applications. When we talk about differentiation, and differentiation is the most famous concept that Bowen would use in family systems. If someone is differentiated, they could do two things well, and here's where the two applications of differentiation happens. They can differentiate between their emotional guidance system and their reasoning guidance system. This allows them to choose to be guided by either system. In other words, at any given moment, they realize both are happening, and they're able to process with a series of tools, a series of ways to consider, to mitigate, to actually apply, that you can choose between the two. So it begins with your internal system. That is a part of differentiation. But then the second part of differentiation is that a person can differentiate themselves from other people. In other words, they just don't get wrapped up in other people's emotions, and they can be intimate with other people while also remaining separate and individuated. In this case of differentiation from other people, the goal is that even when somebody is being caustic or somebody's being unkind, you can hold on to yourself and apply boundaries to keep yourself safe, to keep yourself strong, to keep yourself in a healthy, functional place. However, that what we do in differentiation is we realize that many people are suffering their own agitation and anxiety dysregulations. And so we can move into those people, even when they're being unkind to us, we can be kind to them. Listen, the only way that part works, the only way, is if you are sure of who you are and who you're not, what you want and don't want, and you can remain in a boundary where you're disallowing a person to do something that would harm you. So this isn't about giving people any kind of freedom that they want to say or do whatever they want to you. This is being able to hold on to yourself while you're giving attempts to be attached to others. Holding on to yourself means I'm not going to let you cuss me. If somebody wants to begin to cuss me, who's close to me, I'm gonna say, you know what, you seem to be very upset right now, and so I'm going to leave. I'm going to hang up. I'm going to walk away. And when you feel like that you're in a better place, holler at me, and man, we'll get together. What you're doing is you're holding on to yourself and realizing that what they are saying and doing is not something for you to live in.
Let me break in one more time and tell you about RedInkRevival.com. That is REDINK Revival.com. I want to encourage you to go there and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it will hit your inbox with a blog post and new special events that will ink your soul with revival. Now, the power of boundaries is if you find yourself dysregulated, that's just key points for you to remove yourself and keep working on who you are as a self. That is to say, you may not be able to get back together with them for quite some time. You have to build boundaries and give consequences that aren't about retribution or punishment. It's about how do I continue to develop myself so that I ultimately can love others better. You see, when we talk about boundaries, boundaries is such a powerful, in fact, it is one of my very most important tools that I help people navigate every conflict issue in their life. Boundaries are critically important, but you need to know that a precursor to boundaries is differentiation. The differentiation really needs to be understood well before you get to boundaries. And then when you get into boundaries, again, if you're dealing with somebody who is inflammatory, they're angry, they are somebody who is going to harm or hurt you, they've been known to abuse. If somebody's abusive, this differentiation says, I love myself too well. I honor the image of God that is in me to such a high level that I'm not going to allow you to mar it, to tarnish it, to diminish it. And so if somebody is abusive, I'm going to step away from the toxic nature of that person so that I can actually love them better. And they won't like it because they'll be like, well, I need and I want and you are, and they'll start naming things and et cetera. And you got to just hold on to yourself. You've got to be able to say, no, there's a boundary here. I told you that if you did that, again, that you wouldn't have access to whatever. Maybe it means that, you go on vacations without them. Maybe it means that you don't invite them to certain family events or other kinds of separateness, that you won't allow them to be a part of the thing. But even while you're doing that, what differentiation says is I'm going to hold space in my heart to continue developing empathy and compassion about what kind of perhaps trauma has happened in their life that made them so mean and so ugly. And so when we talk about differentiation, you have those two basic applications, the differentiation of your emotional guidance system and your reasoning guidance system, those two being differentiated, and then the differentiation of yourself from other people. When I look at the way that the differentiation scale is thought of, so there's this scale that helps us think through the idea of togetherness and individuality. And so I'm going to articulate a particular graphic. I'll see if I can get the graphic to show up on the YouTube video. But for those of you who are listening, the self-differentiation scale is where there is, if you can imagine, there is a pyramid-shaped triangle. On the left side of the triangle, representing the left leg of the triangle, is the word individual, representing independence, distance, and detachment. On the right leg of the triangle is the word together, and it's representing closeness, fusion, and enmeshment. With that image in mind, the goal is to move to the top of the triangle's maturity and less anxiety at the very top point of the triangle. By managing both individuality, or the differentiation of self, and togetherness, which is the closeness, in ways that promote functionality within the relationship system. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop our inner world, to develop our sense of self, our identity, who we are and who we're not, until we can both be together in closeness, caring about people, caring deeply in the attachment and letting them be connected to us. We are developing that while we're also developing our individuality, and we're promoting the functionality within the relationship system. So again, think of that triangle, the pyramid. So you have a triangle. On one side, you have togetherness. On the other side, you have individuality. And then I want you to think about a dotted vertical midline that starts at the bottom of the triangle and goes up to the top point of the triangle. So again, if you look at the left leg and the right leg of the triangle with the point at the top, I want you to think of a midline that is right in the middle. It goes all the way at the top of the point, all the way down to the middle of the base of that triangle. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about the top of that dotted line being maturity and the bottom being immaturity. When you look at the maturity at the top, this is where you have the least anxiety. When you look at the immaturity at the bottom, this is where you have the most anxiety. And so you'll notice that there are some numbers that are in the dotted vertical midline, starting with 0. So you have a number, a scoring, a scale at the bottom, 0 at immaturity, and at the top you have 100 representing maturity. So here's what Dr. Bowen in his family systems, this is what he did to rate people on the differentiation scale from 1 to 100. Again, 100 being completely differentiated. This is where you have the least anxiety, and 1 being completely fused and completely undifferentiated, and that's where the most anxiety is. And so in a family, the person with the lowest number is often, get this, the symptom bearer of the family fusion. So the person with the lowest number, so if you think of a team in a church, you'll think of whoever is in that team with the lowest number on the maturity scale of the differentiation scale, the lowest number, they'll bear the symptoms of the team fusion. Bowen believed that most people stay at the differentiation level that they had when they were left at home, or when they left home, which is very rarely above 60. So think about that. Bowen said that most people would leave their home and they would very rarely be above 60 on the maturity scale. And here's what's crazy. He would say we tend to choose spouses and friends with similar differentiation levels. Like I heard one therapist say that he is a person that when there is big emotions in the room, he will begin to comply and shut down. He will begin to give whatever's needed to happen and then just, not show a lot of other emotion. His wife, on the other hand, is from a family that shows a lot of emotion. So when anxiety hits her, she gets big emotion. It's interesting because they both are expressing their anxiety in different ways. At the same time, they are functioning out of a similar scale measurement of differentiation. So in general, people at higher levels of differentiation, they're going to have less emotional reactivity. They have the ability to calm their emotions. They can make more thoughtful and intentional decisions. They don't give in to pressure from others. They're less vulnerable to stress. They're independent. They're less prone to triangulation. They have the ability to extricate themselves from emotional entanglements. They have fewer physical problems or emotional problems or social problems. And they can have closeness with others without getting lost in the relationship. And they have more fulfilling relationships in general. However, people at lower levels of differentiation are more emotionally reactive. They have difficulty engaging in thoughtful behavior. They have difficulty saying no to people. They're more critical and judgmental. They're overly concerned about approval. They are more dependent on others. They're more prone to triangulation and measurement, disengagement, conflict, and cutoff. They have difficulty making decisions. They have greater physical problems. I think that's interesting. They have emotional problems and social problems. They have difficulty communicating directly. And they repeat problematic relationships rather than learning from their mistakes. See, what Bowen believed is that your differentiation base level is relatively fixed for life. I want you to catch that. Bowen believed that your differentiation base level is relatively fixed for life. In other words, you will cycle and loop and continue to do the same things you've always done in every relationship and in every system. But there is good news. However, your differentiation level will diverge from your baseline depending on your current stress level, and then this, and the coping skills that you employ. In other words, when you are aware of what's happening in you and you begin to develop coping skills. You begin to develop these kind of instinctual practices, these muscle memories that whenever this happens, this is the tool you'll use. This is how you will deconstruct it, pull it apart, look at it and assess it. And then you'll be able to manage both with certain physical soothing kinds of things. You'll be able to do things that keep you healthy and strong, and you'll be able to do things with your mind and with your thoughts that'll keep you in a place of differentiation. Again, this is contingent on the coping skills or these kind of skills about your emotions, what many people call soft skills, but golly, they are the precursor to so many of the hard skills of our lives, because you will always first instinctively do or be moved to the instincts you have and live out and from your emotions. So Bowen believed that you could slowly raise your baseline differentiation level, your score, by managing your emotional reactivity and by de-triangulating yourself from your family of origin, particularly your parents. So again, we have gone over several ideas within the system that Bowen would present, and there's so much here. There's so much to talk about. And so we're doing an entire series. I'm going to give you different components to differentiation. We're going to give you exercises that you can do to build your differentiation muscle or to increase your differentiation scale and score. Wanting to help you see examples that would happen in a family, examples that would happen within your organization. Maybe it's happening in your church or in your leadership teams. Whatever you're involved in, this differentiation will be a game changer. I can tell you that it is a secret code cracker for Patrick Norris. And again, I suffered. I suffered in this for years. I asked and prayed and desired, God, what the heck? What's going on here? How do I figure it out? I have read the books. I've listened to the podcast. I've employed the systems. I've done the processes. Everything on paper, it seems like it ought to work. And yet there's so much torment and you just keep fighting through. And for me, it was one of those deals where you just keep meditating on scripture to keep your joy level and returning. And you have to have moments in the presence of God to bounce back. But what if you didn't have to keep bouncing? What if you just were able to find shalom and peace? The only way you're going to do that is through a differentiated self. And so here at Red Ink Revival, we're creating wholehearted leaders through theology, psychology, and neuroscience. If you are a pastor and you desire to do this work with your staff, I'd love to partner with you in this work. I'm guest speaking on Sundays now and no longer am a pastor leading an exact church. I'm pastor emeritus. I fill an honorary role and I do certain stage things at the church that my wife and I attend. However, I am available to minister on Sundays, and I'm also providing separate life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. So if you'd like me to work with you or your staff or your whole church, just reach out. We can customize our products and service packages to whatever context you have. Just reach out to me at Norris, Norris, Patrick, Patrick, @gmail.com. Well, have a great week, and we will see you next time.